The click of the deadbolt echoed like a gunshot in the hollow gallery. It wasn't loud, but in the sudden, vacuum-sealed silence of the museum at midnight, it felt final. The air conditioning hummed its low, electric note, a vibration you felt in your teeth more than you heard. The scent of varnish and old canvas hung heavy, almost suffocating, mixing with the sharp tang of my own anxiety. I stood frozen near the center installation, my skin prickling under the weight of a gaze I couldn't escape. I turned, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "I need you to look away," I whispered. But Sam didn't move. She just watched me, her eyes dark and unyielding, and the silence stretched between us until it felt like something solid enough to break. 3 hours earlier, that silence had been my only ally. The Nocturne exhibition was my career in a single room, a decade of research, negotiation, and sleepless nights distilled into 40 framed canvases and 3 sculptures. Tomorrow, the grand mahogany doors would swing open to the critics, the board members, the donors who looked at art and saw only tax write-offs and cocktail party conversation. But tonight, it was just me and the obsession. I moved from frame to frame with a laser level in one hand and a microfiber cloth in the other, hunting for imperfections that didn't exist to anyone but me. Lighting was the enemy. A single degree off on the track lights meant the difference between a masterpiece and a glare-obscured mistake. I climbed the ladder for the 50th time, adjusting the beam on a 17th century Dutch portrait. The woman in the painting stared back, her expression ambiguous, caught somewhere between a smile and a grimace. I knew that look well. It was the face of a woman holding her breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wiped a microscopic smudge of dust from the gilded frame, my fingers shaking slightly. It had to be perfect. Precision was the only armor I had left. If the exhibit was flawless, maybe no one would notice that the curator was falling apart. The museum at night is a different creature than it is in the day. Without the chatter of tourists and the squeak of sneakers, the building breathes. Shadows stretched long across the polished marble floors, distorting into shapes that felt predatory. The portraits on the walls seemed to turn their heads as I passed, their painted eyes tracking my frantic energy. I checked the humidity sensors again. 45%. Perfect. I checked the alignment of the title cards. Centered to the millimeter. Perfect. But the knot in my chest didn't loosen. It pulled tighter, a physical ache that radiated out to my fingertips. I was a fraud in a tailored suit, playing the role of the aloof intellectual curator, while my personal life eroded into dust. My apartment was a storage unit for unread mail and empty takeout containers. My last relationship had ended in a text message I hadn't had the energy to reply to. All I had was this room, these lights, this illusion of control. I stepped back to view the main wall, the Vulnerability series. It was supposed to be the emotional anchor of the show, raw and exposing. But looking at it now, in the stark, unforgiving light of 2 a.m., it just looked like paint on canvas. Cold, distant. Just like me. I rubbed my temples, trying to press the headache back behind my eyes. The solitude was starting to turn on me. What I had craved, the quiet, the space to think, was becoming a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room. I needed a distraction, a flaw to fix, something tangible to wrestle with. But the room was finished. It was perfect. And that was the terrifying part. When there's nothing left to fix, you're left with yourself. I paced the length of the gallery, my heels clicking a sharp, lonely rhythm on the stone. I stopped in front of a charcoal sketch, a study of a hand reaching out into darkness. The artist had captured the tension in the tendons, the desperation in the spread fingers. I reached out, my own hand hovering inches from the glass, trembling. The reflection ghosted over the artwork, my pale face, wide eyes, the dark circles I'd carefully concealed with expensive makeup earlier that evening. I looked scared. I looked like I was drowning in the very beauty I was supposed to be protecting. Then the rhythm changed. The silence shattered not by a crash, but by a steady, heavy thud. Boots. Heavy, rubber-soled boots striking the marble with a cadence that was slow, deliberate, and utterly grounded. It wasn't the frantic click of my heels. It was the sound of authority. The sound of someone who owned the space in a way I never would. I froze, my hand dropping to my side, the sudden intrusion of another human presence sending a jolt of adrenaline through my exhausted veins. The footsteps grew louder, echoing down the long corridor leading to the wing, steady as a heartbeat, coming for me. Sam emerged from the shadows of the corridor like she had been woven from them, a solid shape coalescing out of the dark. She wasn't what you'd expect when you think of museum security. No slouching posture, no bored scrolling on a phone hidden behind a desk. She was tall, broad-shouldered in a way that stretched the fabric of her dark blue uniform across her back. Her utility belt was heavy with keys, a radio, a flashlight, items that clinked softly with a metallic rhythm that countered the silence. She stopped at the threshold of the gallery, her gaze sweeping the room with a precision that rivaled my laser level. But she wasn't looking for alignment. She was looking for threats. And for a terrifying second, I felt like the threat was me. I was a bundle of frayed nerves and caffeine, vibrating at a frequency that could shatter glass. Sam was absolute stillness. She didn't fidget. She stood with her feet planted wide, hands resting loosely on her belt, a silent sentinel amidst the chaos of my creation. Her hair was pulled back in a severe knot, exposing the strong line of her jaw and a neck that looked powerful enough to bear the weight of the ceiling if the columns failed. While I had been obsessing over the aesthetic soul of the room, checking the emotional resonance of 17th century oil paint, she was calculating its physical survival. It was a different language of care, one spoken in perimeter checks and lock protocols, rather than color theory and provenance. She began her round, moving along the far wall. I watched her, unable to tear my eyes away. She didn't look at the Rembrandts or the Turners with awe. She looked at the glass cases to ensure they were sealed. She checked the floor vents for obstruction. She looked at the art the way a bodyguard looks at a VIP, not with admiration, but with a possessive, protective intensity. Every time she passed a sensor, she gave a subtle nod, a silent communication with the building's nervous system. I felt useless suddenly, a decorator in a fortress, playing with dolls while she checked the perimeter fence. The jangle of her keys was a chaotic music that somehow signaled order, a reminder that, while I'm curating the past, she was securing the present. "You're running the humidity too low," she said. Her voice was a shock, low, textured like rough stone, vibrating in the empty space. I jumped, nearly dropping my microfiber cloth. "Excuse me?" I managed, my voice pitching too high, defensive, and sharp. She didn't look at me, just kept walking toward the climate control panel, hidden behind a false wall I thought only senior staff knew about. "The storm's dropping the pressure outside," she continued, her tone flat, factual. "If you keep the humidity at 45 inside, the condensation is going to bloom on the interior of the display cases when the temperature differential hits. You'll fog the glass in an hour. The varnish on the nocturne centerpiece will cloud." I stood there, mouth slightly open. I had a PhD in art history. I could tell you the chemical composition of the pigment used in Venice 400 years ago. But I hadn't thought about the dew point. Sam reached the panel, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency over the keypad. Beep, beep, whir. The hum of the AC shifted pitch, a deeper, wetter sound. "Adjusted to 50, she said, turning finally to face me. "It'll hold the fog off until morning." It was a dismissal and a rescue all in one. She had stepped into my domain, my carefully curated world, and effortlessly corrected a flaw I hadn't even seen coming. That was when she really looked at me. Not at the curator tag on my lapel, not at the expensive suit that was supposed to signal my authority. She looked right at the tremor in my hands, the tension in my shoulders. Her eyes were dark, unreadable, but the weight of them was physical. It felt like she was assessing my structural integrity, checking for cracks in the foundation, just like she checked the walls. It was invasive. It was intimate. I wanted to tell her to stop, to retreat to her station, to leave me to my high-minded anxiety. But I couldn't, because in that look, there was no judgment, only a terrifying sort of recognition. She saw the exhaustion I was trying so hard to gild in gold leaf. "You should go home, Dr. Hayes," she said softly. "The art isn't going anywhere." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell her about the lighting, the labels, the stakes. But before I could speak, the building groaned. A deep, resonant shudder that started in the floor and traveled up through the soles of my shoes. The track lights above us flickered, once, twice, plunging the room into momentary grayness before buzzing back to life with a sickly yellow hue. Outside, the first heavy roll of thunder cracked against the skyline. Not distant anymore, but right on top of us. The storm Sam had predicted was here, and the sanctuary of the museum was about to get much smaller. The darkness didn't fall. It crashed down on us. It was a physical weight, heavy and suffocating, extinguishing the meticulously calibrated track lights in a single, heart-stopping second. For a moment, the gallery was pitch black, a void where my life's work used to be. Then the emergency system kicked in. Not the warm, inviting glow of the gallery lights, but harsh, crimson floods that bathed the room in the color of a warning label. The pristine white walls turned the color of dried blood. The marble statues, usually so graceful, cast long, distorted shadows that stretched across the floor like grasping fingers. Then came the sound. A grinding, mechanical shriek that echoed off the vaulted ceiling, drowning out the thunder. I spun around, disoriented in the red haze, watching as heavy steel shutters began to descend over the floor-to-ceiling windows I had fought the board for months to install. They rolled down with the inevitability of a guillotine blade, clank, 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 sealing away the city lights, the street below, and the only exit I could see. The room wasn't just dark now. It was a cage. "The sensors!" The scream tore out of my throat before I could stop it. My first thought wasn't for my safety. It was for the wood panels of the 17th century triptych. "The HVAC is down. If the humidity spikes, the varnish will cloud. The expansion rates..." I was moving blindly, stumbling toward the environmental control panel, my heels slipping on the polished stone. Panic was a cold liquid flooding my veins. I couldn't see the laser lines I'd measured so carefully. My perfect world was dissolving into chaos. The silence of the air conditioning was deafening. Without its constant hum, the room felt dead, stagnant. Stop. The word was a wall. It didn't shout. It simply occupied the space so completely there was no room for my hysteria. A beam of white light sliced through the red gloom, blindingly bright, pinning me to the spot like a specimen in a jar. Sam stood 10 feet away, her flashlight steady in her hand, the beam cutting a cone of clarity through the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. She wasn't looking at the control panel. She was looking up at the skylight, where the rain was beginning to sound like gravel being dumped on the roof. "Get away from the center of the room," she ordered. Her voice had dropped an octave, stripping away any pretense of deference. This wasn't the guard speaking to the curator anymore. This was the survivor speaking to the liability. "The wind shear is hitting 70 knots. If that glass above us gives, it's coming down in shards." I froze, looking up. The massive glass pane rattled in its frame, a terrified vibration that resonated in my teeth. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, heavy with the sudden realization of physical danger that eclipsed my professional anxiety. I was standing directly under the nocturne skylight, the architectural centerpiece of the wing, and it sounded like it was screaming. Sam moved then. She didn't run, she flowed. She crossed the distance between us in 3 long strides, the flashlight beam dipping to the floor to illuminate a path through the shadows. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for me to process the threat. Her hand closed around my upper arm, firm, unyielding, a grip that promised safety but demanded compliance. Her fingers were warm through the silk of my blouse, a shocking contrast to the sudden chill in the room. In the sterile world of the museum, we didn't touch. We barely breathed the same air. But here, in the dark, her grip was the only thing that felt real. She pulled me, not roughly, but with a steady, inexorable force, guiding me away from the center of the room, away from the vulnerability of the open floor, and toward the reinforced alcove of the structural wall. "Move," she murmured, her breath close to my ear, smelling of peppermint and rain. The generators take 60 seconds to cycle. Until then, you don't argue with gravity. We huddled against the far wall. The gallery, which had been a vast expanse of culture and prestige moments ago, now shrunk to a 5-foot square of safety. The shutters finished their descent with a final, resounding boom that vibrated through the floorboards. We were sealed in. The red emergency lights flickered, casting Sam's profile in sharp relief. The strong nose, the set jaw, the eyes that were scanning the darkness for threats I couldn't even imagine. "The art," I whispered, my voice trembling, realizing how small I sounded. "The art will survive a few minutes of humidity, Dr. Hayes," she said, her voice vibrating in her chest, close enough that I could feel the rumble of it against my side. She didn't let go of my arm. "But you won't survive a pane of tempered glass to the skull. Breathe." I tried to inhale, but the air was thick, charged with the static of the storm and the sudden, overwhelming proximity of her body. The hierarchy of the museum had collapsed with the power grid. There were no titles in the dark, only the person who knew how to survive and the person who didn't. And as I stood there, pressed into the shadows by the woman I had ignored for months, I realized I was the one who was lost. The silence didn't last. The storm outside slammed against the building with renewed fury, a physical blow that made the floorboards tremble beneath the marble. It was a deep, resonant vibration, the kind that travels through the soles of your feet and settles in your teeth. Then I heard it, a scrape, a terrible, grinding sound of metal against stone. I spun around, the beam of Sam's flashlight following my gaze. In the center of the room, the void structure, a 400-pound geometric installation made of raw, unpolished steel, was moving. The vibration of the storm was walking it toward the edge of its plinth. If it tipped, it would crash through the glass floor panel of the atrium below. It would destroy the piece, the floor, and my career in a single catastrophic thunderclap. I didn't think. I didn't calculate. I just ran. I threw my shoulder against the cold, biting metal of the sculpture, my heels skidding on the polished floor. I shoved against the slide, trying to counter the momentum, but physics was a cruel opponent. The steel was freezing, sucking the heat right out of my body through my silk blouse. It groaned, shifting another inch, pressing back against me with the inexorable weight of gravity. I gritted my teeth, my boots slipping, my muscles screaming as I tried to become a human anchor. It wasn't enough. I was losing traction. The sculpture tipped slightly, a terrifying lurch that threatened to crush me if I didn't let go. But I couldn't let go. "Don't fight the slide." Sam's voice was right at my ear, calm and authoritative. She didn't shove me aside. She slotted in next to me, her shoulder jamming against the steel, her body forming a solid line of defense alongside mine. "We can't stop it. We have to lower it." "It's too heavy," I gasped, the air squeezed out of my lungs by the effort. "We can't." "We can," she cut in, her tone brooking no argument. "On my count. We guide it down, brace your legs, wider stance, drop your center." I did as I was told, instinctively mirroring her posture. Sam moved with a terrifying efficiency. She shifted her grip, her hands, gloved in black tactical fabric, finding purchase on the smooth metal where my manicured fingers had slipped. She smelled of rain and gun oil, a sharp, grounding scent that cut through the panic. "Ready," she commanded. 3, 2, 1, drop. We moved in unison. It wasn't a graceful lowering. It was a controlled collapse. The weight of the steel was immense, a crushing burden that required every ounce of strength I possessed. I felt the strain in my lower back, the burn in my thighs, but I wasn't bearing it alone. Beside me, Sam was a powerhouse. I could feel the heat radiating from her, the bunch and release of the muscles in her arm as she took the brunt of the load. Her uniform brushed against my arm, the rough canvas friction against my skin sending a jolt through me that had nothing to do with the cold metal. For 10 agonizing seconds, we were a single organism fighting gravity. There was no curator, no guard. There was no PhD, no hourly wage. There was just the raw, physical reality of mass and force. The hierarchy of the daylight hours evaporated in the red emergency light. I wasn't directing her. I was relying on her. Her breathing was rhythmic, heavy, a metronome that kept me from panicking. "Steady," she grunted, the words strained through clenched teeth. "Almost There. With a final heavy thud that shook the floor, the sculpture settled onto the marble. It was safe. It looked ridiculous sitting there on the ground, off its pedestal, stripped of its pretension. But it was whole. I slumped against the cold steel, gasping for air, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My legs felt like jelly. I slid down until I was sitting on the floor, my back against the installation we had just saved. Sam didn't move away. She leaned against the sculpture next to me, her chest heaving slightly, her flashlight resting on the floor and casting long, distorted shadows across the room. We sat there in the semi-darkness, shoulder to shoulder, the adrenaline slowly receding to leave a raw, vibrating awareness in its wake. The air between us was thick, charged with the heat of our exertion. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, or maybe it was the sound of her breathing syncing with mine. The professional distance I had maintained for months, the polite nods, the averted eyes, had been obliterated by 400 pounds of steel. I turned my head to look at her. In the red wash of the emergency lights, the sharp planes of her face looked softer, damp with sweat. A stray lock of dark hair had escaped her severe bun and was sticking to her temple. She wasn't looking at the art. She was looking at her hands, flexing her fingers slowly, checking for damage. "You have good balance," she said quietly, her voice rougher than usual. She didn't look up, but I saw the corner of her mouth twitch. Most people would have let it fall. "I couldn't," I whispered, the confession slipping out before I could polish it. "It's the only thing in here that's actually mine." She turned then, and the intensity of her gaze pinned me to the cold steel. The storm raged outside, battering the walls, but in that small, red-lit space on the floor, the world had narrowed down to the sound of our breathing and the terrifying proximity of her arm pressing against mine. The adrenaline didn't fade gracefully. It crashed out of me like water from a broken dam, leaving my limbs shaking and my chest hollow. I couldn't stand anymore. I sank onto the velvet viewing bench in the center of the room, the fabric rough against my palms. Sam followed, her movements slower now, the urgency of the crisis replaced by a heavy, deliberate calm. She sat beside me, not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could feel the radiant heat of her body through the damp air. "Here," she said. She reached into her utility bag and pulled out a battered stainless steel thermos. The sound of the lid unscrewing was sharp in the quiet, followed by the rising steam of something that smelled like roasted nuts and burnt sugar. She poured a cup and held it out. "I'm not supposed to have liquids in the gallery," I said automatically. The rule was a reflex, a ghost of the person I was 10 minutes ago. "We're not supposed to be trapped in a blackout during a hurricane either," Sam replied, her voice dry. "Drink. Your hands are shaking." I took the plastic cup. It was warm, a small anchor in the cold red room. I took a sip. It was cheap, bitter, gas station coffee, but it tasted like life. I closed my eyes, letting the heat slide down my throat, melting the knot of ice in my chest. When I opened them, Sam was watching me again. She wasn't drinking. She was just holding the thermos, her thumb tracing the dented metal rim. "Why?" she asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question, low and curious. "You almost threw your back out for a piece of steel. It's insured. It's replaceable." I looked at the void structure, sitting darkly on the floor where we'd wrestled it. "It's not about the insurance," I whispered. The truth felt easier to speak in the dark. "It's about the order. Out there," I gestured vaguely toward the shuttered windows, toward the city, my apartment, the mess of my life. "Out there, everything is chaos. People leave. Feelings change. You can do everything right and still lose. But in here, if I align the frame perfectly, it stays. If I control the light, the shadow falls exactly where I want it to. I curate because it's the one place where I can force the world to make sense." I expected her to laugh or to give me the pitying look my therapist used when I talked about my need for control. But Sam just nodded, looking out into the shadows. "I get that," she said softly. "But you can't curate gravity." "I know," I admitted, the vulnerability swirling in my stomach with the coffee. "I feel like a fraud half the time. I wear the suits, I speak the jargon, I act like I own the place. But really? I'm just terrified that if I stop fixing things, everyone will see that I'm just making it up as I go. That I'm not the curator. I'm just the girl who's afraid of the dark. Sam shifted, the leather of her belt creaking. She took the cup from my hand, her fingers brushing mine. Rough, calloused skin against my manicured smoothness. The contact lingered for a second too long before she poured herself a measure. You think you're invisible because you're hiding behind the job, Sam said, taking a sip. But I see you. I'm the guard. People look right through me, like I'm part of the drywall. They think I'm just here to yell at kids for touching the statues. But the job isn't watching the art. It's watching the people. She turned to face me fully, her knee knocking lightly against mine. She didn't pull away. I see the way you talk to the portraits when you think the cameras are dead spots, she continued, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the bench. I see you eating lunch at your desk because you're afraid to miss an email. I see you fixing the same label 5 times because you need it to be perfect. You're not a fraud, Dr. Hayes. You care more than anyone else in this building. You're just the only one who thinks the weight of the roof is entirely on your shoulders. Her words stripped me bare. It was terrifying. I had spent years building a fortress of competence and distance, and she had walked right through the walls without even trying. She saw the cracks I'd plastered over. And miraculously, she didn't seem to mind them. Sam, I breathed. It was the first time I'd used her name. It tasted heavy, significant. You protect the beauty, she said, her eyes locking onto mine, dark and intense in the emergency light. I protect the protector. That's the job. The air in the room changed then. The smell of rain and old canvas faded, replaced by the sharp electric tension of proximity. The professional distance wasn't just gone. It had been replaced by a magnetic pull that terrified me. I looked at her lips, then up to her eyes, and saw the same hunger reflected there. We weren't colleagues anymore. We were 2 survivors on a velvet bench, and the storm outside was nothing compared to the sudden, quiet thunder between us. The coffee was finished, but the warmth of it, and the warmth of her confession, lingered in my chest, unsettling and strange. The silence on the bench had shifted from comfortable to heavy, a loaded pause that felt like it was waiting for a spark. I stood up abruptly, the sudden motion a desperate attempt to outrun the intimacy that was settling over us like dust. I needed an object, a subject, something to place between us that wasn't my own exposed psyche. Come, I said, my voice sounding jagged in the quiet. I want to show you why this exhibition matters, why I fight for it. I led her toward the far wall, to the centerpiece I had spent 3 years negotiating to borrow from a private collection in Berlin. In the harsh, flat light of day, the unfinished woman was a study in technical brilliance, a charcoal and oil rendering of a figure half emerged from a dark, chaotic background. But here, under the throbbing red pulse of the emergency floods, the painting looked less like art and more like an open wound. The crimson light turned the charcoal shadows into bruises, and the pale oils of the skin into something feverish and alive. We stopped 2 feet from the canvas. I fell into my professional stance automatically, hands clasped behind my back, chin tilted up, the lecturer preparing to educate the masses. It was a reflex, a way to put the armor back on. This is the anchor of the Nocturne series, I began, my voice echoing slightly in the empty wing. Technically, it's fascinating because of the use of negative space. The artist, struggling with the loss of her sight, began to paint by touch as much as by vision. You can see the heavy impasto here on the shoulder, where she physically built up the paint to create a ridge. She was trying to create a boundary between the figure and the void, a tactile proof of existence. I pointed to the jagged line where the figure's arm dissolved into the darkness. I waited for Sam to nod, to ask about the date, to offer a polite hum of interest. But she didn't. She stood just behind my right shoulder, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from her uniform, silent as the stone floor beneath us. The critics argue that the lack of definition in the face represents the anonymity of grief, I continued. But the words felt like ash in my mouth. They were dry, academic, useless. They were the words I used to keep donors happy and boards complacent. They had nothing to do with why I stood in front of this painting at 3 a.m. when the insomnia hit. I faltered. The lecture died in my throat. I looked at the painted woman, half-formed, struggling to pull herself out of the black oil, her posture one of exhausted resilience. She wasn't a study in negative space. She was a scream trapped in 2 dimensions. "That's not true," I whispered, dropping the curator's mask. My hands unclasped, falling uselessly to my sides. "It's not about grief. It's about the effort it takes to stay visible when everything around you is trying to erase you. She isn't unfinished. She's just tired of holding herself together." The truth hung in the air, raw and unauthorized. I hadn't meant to say it. I hadn't meant to admit that I looked at that canvas and saw my own exhaustion reflected back at me. The endless, grinding effort to maintain the shape of a perfect life against the encroaching chaos. I turned to look at Sam, expecting confusion, expecting her to be looking at the brushstrokes I had pointed out. She wasn't looking at the painting. Sam was looking at me. Her gaze was heavy, darker than the shadows in the corners of the room, and completely unflinching. She wasn't studying the art. She was studying the woman standing in front of it. She was looking at the line of my throat, the tremor in my hands, the way my chest rose and fell with shallow, nervous breaths. It was the way a person looks at something rare and dangerous, with a mix of reverence and caution. For a curator, being looked at is wrong. I am the lens, not the subject. I am the one who directs the gaze, who frames the beauty, who stands in the background explaining the genius of others. But under Sam's eyes, the frame had shifted. I was the one on display. I was the one being interpreted. "She looks like she's waiting for permission to let go," Sam said quietly. Her voice wasn't directed at the canvas. It was aimed straight at the center of my chest. The air between us tightened, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. This wasn't professional respect. This wasn't friendly banter. This was a stripping down, a peeling back of layers that felt terrifyingly precise. She saw the unfinished woman, but she knew the model was standing right in front of her. "Sam," I breathed, the name feeling like a plea. She took a step closer. The distance between us evaporated. I could smell the rain on her skin again, stronger now, mixed with the scent of the coffee and the metallic tang of the storm. The red light washed over us, blurring the edges of the room until the only thing in focus was the dark intensity of her eyes. The museum, the storm, the career, it all fell away. There was only the terrifying realization that I didn't want her to stop looking. I wanted her to see everything I had spent a lifetime hiding. And that desire was more dangerous than any hurricane. The red emergency light turned the air into a heavy crimson fog, but the heat rising in my skin had nothing to do with the humidity and everything to do with the way Sam was looking at me. It was unbearable. I was used to being the observer, the critic, the one who stood safely behind the velvet rope and analyzed the brushstrokes of other people's vulnerability. But Sam had crossed the rope. Her gaze was a physical weight, pressing against the cracks in my composure, prying them open with a terrifying, silent persistence. It wasn't the deferential glance of a subordinate or the polite interest of a colleague. It was an unmaking. She was stripping away the curator, the degree, the tailored suit, and the carefully constructed persona of the woman who had everything under control. She was looking right at the raw, trembling mess underneath. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have a label to slap on it to make it make sense. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a bird trapped in a cage that was suddenly too small. The intimacy of the moment was suffocating. It was too much, too fast, a collision of worlds that were never meant to touch. I felt exposed in a way that made my skin ache, a phantom sunburn radiating from the inside out. I took a sharp step back, my heel clicking loudly on the marble, a desperate attempt to reclaim the physical distance if I couldn't reclaim the emotional one. I tried to summon the voice I used for difficult board meetings, the cold, imperious tone that built walls out of syllables, but my throat felt tight, constricted by the sudden, overwhelming need to flee. "Sam," I started, but the name came out as a fractured whisper, lacking all authority. I couldn't meet her eyes anymore. I looked at the badge on her chest, at the scuffed leather of her utility belt, at the dark shadows pooling in the corners of the room, anywhere but at the truth staring back at me. "I need you to look away." The words hung in the charged silence between us, heavy and desperate. It wasn't a command. It was a plea for self-preservation. I was telling her that I couldn't survive this, that my structural integrity was failing, and if she didn't stop seeing me, I was going to collapse right there on the gallery floor. I waited for her to apologize, to step back, to retreat into the safe, invisible role of the guard. I waited for the dynamic to reset to the comfortable hierarchy where I was the expert and she was the background. But Sam didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't apologize. Instead, I heard the deliberate shift of her weight, the creak of leather and the heavy thud of a boot taking a step forward. She wasn't retreating. She was advancing. She was challenging the very instinct that told me to hide. "No," she said, the word low and rough, vibrating through the scant inches of space remaining between us. "You've been looking away your whole life, Dr. Hayes. You don't get to hide in my gallery." My breath hitched, trapped in my chest. She had called it her gallery. And in that moment, facing the storm and the silence and the woman standing like a monolith in the red dark, I knew she was right. She stepped into my personal space, obliterating the last barrier. She raised her hand and I flinched, a reflex born of a lifetime of guarding against impact. But she didn't stop. Her movement was slow, telegraphing her intent, giving me every chance to run. I didn't run. Her hand settled on my waist. It wasn't a tentative brush or an accidental graze. It was a claim. Her palm was broad and warm, the heat of it searing through the thin silk of my blouse, shocking and undeniable. Her fingers splayed out, firm and grounding, her thumb digging gently into the curve of my hip bone. It was a hold that spoke of protection, not possession, a physical anchor in a world that had been spinning out of control for hours. The panic that had been rising in my throat suddenly crested and broke, dissolving into a liquid weakness that made my knees tremble. I should have pushed her away. I should have cited protocol, but the warmth of her hand was the only real thing in the room. It silenced the academic inside me who wanted to analyze the moment and woke up the woman who just wanted to be held. I looked up, finally meeting her eyes again, and stopped fighting. I let the breath leave my lungs, let my shoulders drop, and leaned, just an inch, into the safety of her touch. Sam's hand on my waist was the fulcrum, the still point around which the rest of the chaotic night finally stopped spinning. The red emergency lights pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat, like the heart of the building itself. But the terror of the storm outside felt miles away now. There was only the immediate, terrifying proximity of her body and the silent question hanging in the air between us. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. She read the surrender in the way my hands had come up to rest tentatively on her forearms, clutching the rough fabric of her uniform like it was a lifeline. She read it in the way I hadn't pulled back from the intimacy of her touch, but had instead leaned into it, starving for contact I hadn't allowed myself to want for years. Slowly, deliberately, Sam withdrew her hand. The loss of contact was a physical ache, a cold draft rushing into the space where her warmth had been. I made a small, involuntary sound of protest, but she was already moving. She turned and walked toward the heavy double doors of the gallery entrance. Her boots were silent now, or maybe I just couldn't hear them over the pounding of my own heart. She reached the doors and placed her hand on the brass lock mechanism. The sound of the deadbolt turning was loud in the quiet room. Clack, thud. It was the sound of the world being shut out. It was the sound of a decision being made. She wasn't locking us in. She was locking everything else out. The expectations, the protocols, the board members, the art critics, the fear of failure. All of it was left on the other side of that mahogany barrier. Inside, there was just the red light, the hum of the generator, and us. Sam turned back to face me. She didn't rush. She walked back across the marble floor with that same steady, grounded stride that had intimidated me hours ago. Now, it felt like a promise. She stopped inches from me, close enough that our chests were almost touching, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in her dark irises. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Her voice was rough, stripped of all professional polish. It was a final check, a last opportunity for the curator to step back into her role and dismiss the guard. I didn't speak. I couldn't. Instead, I reached up and tangled my fingers in the collar of her uniform, pulling her down to me. The kiss wasn't like the movies. It wasn't graceful or perfectly choreographed. It was desperate. It was a collision of mouths and teeth and breath, a frantic release of months of repressed tension. Sam groaned low in her throat, a sound that vibrated against my lips, and her arms wrapped around me properly this time, pulling me flush against her solid frame. The contrast was overwhelming. Her uniform was rough canvas, abrasive against my silk blouse. Her hands were calloused and strong against the softness of my skin. The cold air of the museum pressed against my back, but the front of my body was burning where I was pressed against her. She tasted of coffee and rain, a dark, earthy flavor that filled my senses completely. My hands found their way into her hair, pulling it free from its severe knot. It tumbled down around her shoulders, thick and dark, softening the hard lines of her face. She wasn't the stoic sentinel anymore. She was a woman with a racing heart and hands that roamed over my back with a hunger that matched my own. One of her hands tangled in my hair, tilting my head back, deepening the kiss until I felt dizzy, untethered from the earth. For the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about the lighting. I wasn't analyzing the composition. I wasn't worrying about the humidity or the reviews. I was just feeling. The scratch of her wool sweater, the heat of her skin, the absolute solidity of her presence, holding me up when my legs threatened to give out. I had spent my career trying to preserve beauty in glass cases, trying to stop time, trying to control the narrative. But this messy, heated, uncurated moment was more beautiful than any painting on the walls. "I've got you," Sam murmured against my mouth, her breath hot on my cheek. "I've got you, Elena." Hearing my first name on her lips broke something inside me. It was the final shattering of the facade. I buried my face in the crook of her neck, breathing her in, my hands clutching her shoulders. I realized then that the loss of control I had feared so much wasn't a failure. It was a relief. It was safety. Outside, the storm finally broke. The rain slowed to a gentle patter against the roof, and the wind died down to a whisper. The red emergency lights flickered, and then, with a buzz, the main track lights hummed back to life, bathing the gallery in soft, warm white. But we didn't move apart. We stood there, in the center of the room, the curator and the guard, wrapped in each other's arms, while the unfinished woman watched us from the wall, no longer alone in the dark. Dawn didn't arrive with fanfare. It crept in gray and quiet, filtering through the skylight we had feared would shatter just hours before. The light hit the marble floor, washing away the crimson stain of the emergency floods, replacing the drama of the night with the stark, undeniable reality of morning. We had untangled ourselves hours ago, retaking our separate corners of the room as the building woke up around us. The first shift of cleaners would be unlocking the service entrance in 20 minutes. The spell of the storm was lifting, but the air between us still hummed, charged with a static that refused to ground. I stood by the unfinished woman, smoothing down the front of my blouse. It was wrinkled. My hair was a disaster, loose and wild around my shoulders. I caught my reflection in the glass of a display case and paused. I didn't look perfect. I looked tired. I looked undone. And for the first time in 10 years, I didn't hate it. I looked like a woman who had survived something real. Sam was over by the main doors, checking the lock mechanism she had turned with such finality the night before. She had pulled her hair back into its severe knot, her uniform straightened, her utility belt sitting heavy on her hips. To anyone else, she was just the guard again. But I saw the way her hands moved, slower, less mechanical. I saw the way her eyes kept flicking toward me, not with the professional surveillance of yesterday, but with a warm, private gravity that pulled at my chest. The staff entrance buzzed. The heavy thud of the cleaner's cart echoed from the hallway. The world was rushing back in. We had seconds. I walked toward her. I didn't have my clipboard. I didn't have my laser level. I just had myself. Sam stopped her inspection as I approached, her back straightening, falling into parade rest. But her eyes softened, the dark irises holding a warmth that melted the last of my professional resolve. "The humidity held," she said quietly, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. "The art survived," I replied, stopping just inside the boundary of her personal space. but I think the curator might be permanently altered. She reached out, her hand brushing my knuckles, a touch so fleeting it might have been accidental to an observer, but it sent a jolt of memory through me. The weight of her hand on my waist, the taste of rain, the safety of the locked door. "Good," she whispered. She needed a little restructuring. The day blurred into a chaotic symphony of logistics. The catering team arrived with trays of champagne flutes, clinking glass against the silence. The lighting technicians fussed over the spots I had agonized over, but I waved them away. It didn't matter if the beam was 2 degrees off. The art wasn't about the light. It was about the feeling. I moved through the gallery, greeting the junior staff, answering questions, but my internal compass had shifted. I wasn't navigating by the anxiety of perfection anymore. I was orienting myself by the dark blue uniform, moving steadily through the periphery of the room. We moved in a silent orbit, a shared glance over a checklist, a moment in the break room where she handed me a fresh coffee, her fingers lingering on the cup, a silent reminder of the thermos we shared in the dark. It was a secret language, spoken in the middle of a crowd, grounding me when the noise became too much. By evening, the gallery was full. The air smelled of expensive perfume and white wine. Voices chattered, a meaningless drone of praise and critique. I stood at the podium, gripping the microphone, the spotlight blinding me. I looked out at the sea of faces, the board members, the city elite, and felt the familiar wave of imposter syndrome cresting. Then I looked to the back of the room. Sam was there, standing guard by the main exit. She wasn't looking at the crowd. She was looking right at me, her expression unreadable to them, but shouting to me. "You don't have to hide." I took a breath, steadying myself not on my notes, but on her presence. I began to speak, not the academic jargon I had rehearsed, the sterile words about provenance and technique. I talked about vulnerability. I talked about the strength it takes to let things be unfinished, to let the cracks show. I spoke about the terror of being seen, really seen, and the courage it takes to stand still while someone looks at you. I spoke to the room, but my words were for the woman standing in the shadows, the one who had taught me that the most valuable thing in the museum wasn't behind glass. As the applause broke, polite and hollow, I caught Sam's eye across the crowded room. She tipped her chin, a tiny, private salute that nobody else saw. The masterpiece wasn't on the wall behind me. It was a woman standing guard, the one who saw the cracks and locked the door to keep them safe. If you've ever found safety in the arms of the one who protects you, subscribe for more stories.